Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
You good people, and listen to my song. I hope
Kyle Anzelone, welcome to Fortress on a Hill. Thank you for taking the time to come chat with me.
Yeah, happy to be on. I've listened to the show on and off through the years. You know, you get more time when you're driving around more, but I do listen. And so it was nice, for the first time I have a face to match with the voice that I've heard quite a few times. And you and Danny and Keegan do a great job. And I've enjoyed especially your breakdown on Joe Biden's foreign policy. That was probably about a year ago, but that I really enjoyed that show. So really happy to be on today.
Yeah, totally. Glad to have you. Just to give people a little bit of background for you, you are the news editor of the Libertarian Institute. You're an assistant editor at antiwar.com, and most prevalently for our discussion today, you are the co-host of Conflicts of Interest with Will Porter, also of the Libertarian Institute. So I wanted to talk to you about your podcast a little bit. Can you tell me, kind of how did you get started? What your overall goals were for it? Stuff like that.
Yeah, so I started doing the news roundup in like June of 2016 on a blog I had at the time. And then like in November of that year, I moved that over to the Libertarian Institute, and I don't know, like a year later I got the official title of news editor, but that's kind of why I do as news editor of the Libertarian Institute. And then doing that, like I had various people invite me on podcasts and stuff like that, and I kind of enjoyed it. And also, when you're writing about these kind of things and reading the news all day, you need somebody to talk about this stuff too. But at the same time, like the people you live with don't just want to hear you yell about the wars all day. Like that's not what they want to do. And also, like, you don't want to build all of your relationships on that either. And so I started doing the show kind of just because I like has a lot of stuff I wanted to say and needed somebody to say it to. And even if only 100 people are listening to the show or whatever in the first few months, like, people were listening to me talking about the things I wanted to talk about. And the original show is Foreign Policy Focus. I started that in February of 2017. Mostly covered like Syria stuff and in Russiagate really heavy in the first couple of years. But over time, it morphed into, what like conflicts of interest is now, where I talk about, world news in general. I am a libertarian, so like some of it's like a little bit libertarian interest topics. If it's like, more even I think it's wider ranging, but drug war stuff like that, police militarization, I do get into on the show. But 95% of the coverage is just on the different wars going on around the world and geopolitics. And I mean, that's what interests me. That's what I cover in my news roundup. That's what I do the viewpoints at antiwar.com. And so reading all those articles all the time. Danny Shershon is such a prolific writer, and I read hundreds of his articles. And a lot of what I learned and talk about on the show is stuff like I learned in part from Danny, from Scott Horton, Ray McGovern, all these great people who I read articles of multiple times a week. And that's why I try to distill down and talk about my show, because I know there are some people who don't want to read a bunch of news stories from Reuters every day and pick out, the truth from the government spin. Because the only reason anybody would ever oppose expanding the draft to women, by the way, is because of traditional gender roles. Nobody would just have a general opposition to the draft or anything like that. And that's the way like Reuters and all these mainstream news outlets have been reporting it all week. And so reading that stuff could get really tedious. And I thought I'd do a show just kind of talking about what's going on and breaking it down. And, then like putting, my anti-war mainly, but also libertarian, take on these issues in trying to like break down and break out the propaganda and all that. So that's kind of my show. That's what I do. Most people just listen to it, so I try to make it very friendly to the audio only audience, but I do a video show that goes up on YouTube, and with conflicts of interest, I always have like the articles that I'm doing, and like I scroll through them. Sometimes if it's necessary, maps or stuff like that, like when I'm trying to explain what the Taiwanese air defense identification zone is versus the Taiwanese airspace, video does help with that. No matter how I explain, like, oh, the air defense identification zone, it kind of goes midway between Taiwan and the Philippines. That doesn't help anybody understand anything. Sometimes you read these stories in even national newspapers, and they're like, that's about the distance from, I don't know, like Baltimore to New York City. And it's like, if you haven't lived on the East Coast, that doesn't mean anything to you, right? And it's just as unrelatable like when I try to say that about Taiwan and the Philippines. So like it does help to have the video, but I do make it again very audio friendly, and that's the way most people listen. So yeah, at least 3 days a week I do shows breaking down the news, again mostly foreign policy stuff.
Yeah, I fit into that audio only grouping, and it has you've done a really good job with the audio and making the vast majority of the content really accessible from that way. I also really appreciate that you have a show that talks a little more of the everyday sludge in the military industrial complex. That when Scott does shows, he does shows on things that are that stuff that he's studied for a long time. But in terms of his guests and everything, that sometimes it can be overwhelming taking in all of that information at once. And Scott's really good at it, but he just does it very quickly. But with your guys' show, that you're able to get more into the meat and potatoes of what people see every day. Your average Reuters article and the crap that's in it, the lines that people continually put out there without qualification, without trying to question it in any way. And I think that's a really good thing. I know that I'm more than a few years into being anti-war, but still talking about those different issues, and because there's so many of them that deal with so many of the same subjects, but it's not always accessible. Um, so today you and I, we talked about, we were going to talk about a recent piece from the New York Times about a drone strike cell during the war with ISIS, part of Operation Inherent Resolve, which was the main operation that the umbrella for all of their activities against ISIS when that part was going on. And this specific strike cell was actually populated by members of Delta Force, of the Tier 1 special operations guys that we send to do what the American militarism deems the worst of the worst, the guys that absolutely have to die, or they're going to come to the American homeland and cause horror untold, or so we're told. Um, but specifically about this particular story, that it got so bad with this particular strike cell in terms of their use of drone strikes, that other people, other three-letter agency people that were affiliated with this cell, Air Force intelligence, I want to say there was some CIA people, and among others, that cried foul, that said that these guys were bombing indiscriminately. They were using uh, the umbrella of self-defense to say that many of their strikes were in actual defense of proxy forces or other American forces that were on the ground, when that wasn't true at all. They would get into arguments with some of the other cell people that weren't with Delta, trying to saying that kids that were running
Green
around in the
Berets, I
street.
believe, right? They
What?
were US Army Green Berets. And the way I understood it in the article was that this task force was kind of made up of the Delta Force, which was calling in the strikes, and then the Berets, which were training and more working along with the Kurds.
Hmm.
Although it wasn't clear to me which ones. And the only reason I want to bring this up and to mention this at the start, if you go to the very first article that myself and Will Porter wrote together, it's at the Libertarian Institute, and it's on civilian casualties in Mosul. And we actually had a Green Beret talk to us about what he felt like was a lot of civilian casualties. And he didn't come forward to us and was like, they're willingly just massacring civilians for no reason or anything like that. But he was like, yeah, they're killing a lot of civilians in this fighting. And so when I read this article, that's the context that I read it in, something I already knew, that they were just like at this time just dropping bombs all over the place in Iraq and Syria. But that was a little bit of interesting context, and like I get a little bit more of a fuller picture now of what's going on, because they really do get statements in this article from people who were involved and just how horrific all this was. But yeah, go ahead, sorry to jump in.
No, no, I had noted it a little bit later, but they had talked about how that the Delta guys in the cell were divided between working in the cell and then two other missions on the ground there. One was that they had embedded with certain forces, and like what you're talking about with the Green Berets. And then they also, their third thing was that they were part of a, if needed, assault force to go after high value targets. And that, it didn't say this in the article, but I got the impression that those guys, whether they were Green Berets or Delta, and I guess for our purposes it really doesn't make a difference, which um, that that if they're rotating between all these three missions, how in the world can the guys actually get some experience in terms of what's actually supposed to be going on? And that's, assuming for a minute we're okay with the strikes, and that okay, if you follow the rules, fine. But they did not do that at all, and we know from hardened experience that most drone strikes end up killing civilians. I don't even know in terms of the numbers and all those kind of things, but like you mentioned about the offensive in Mosul and the overall war in ISIS, that the discrepancy between what the American government has been willing to admit and what's actually happening on the ground was huge. Like the air wars tracking for casualties during the ISIS offensive was far and away. I want to say the one I saw this morning was like they had somewhere between like 7,000 and 9,000 casualties, where the headquarters for Operation Inherent Resolve was only admitting about like 1,400. So we're talking about like a 75 to maybe 85% difference in what we're actually even tracking here. And these are on strikes that are doing what they say is the right thing, not on ones that these guys are fucking with and trying to use as self-defense. So just to give a little more context here, quote, the unit directed airstrikes and drone fired missiles at crowds and residential buildings, quote, killing people who had no role in the conflict, farmers trying to harvest, children in the streets, families fleeing fighting, and villagers sheltering in buildings. So what a couple of the different things that they did here to make it seem like the strikes that they were carrying out were legitimate, that they figured out early in their time there. And of course this strike cell was going from like, it was like 2014 to 2019, I think, something like that. So it was
Mhm.
a number of years. So we can't say this for every Delta person or Green Beret that worked in this spot, but that they weaponized the concept of self-defense to allow them to make strikes that otherwise they would have had no ability to actually defend, to actually legitimize it in any other way. And you had lots of these instances. I'm going to read a few of them here in a minute. The next thing that's really disturbing, and I don't even know how they were able to convince the drone operators to do this, but at certain points they told the drone operators to turn the cameras away from where they were striking. That most drone units, they want to have the cameras on the strike because everything gets recorded and they can go back later and they can look at what happened. By turning the cameras away, they were deliberately choosing to not gather evidence as to what that strike actually could end up causing. They were arguing with some of the intelligence staff about whether the people they saw in the drone footage was fighters or children or old people. And then the third part, and this goes into the overall special operations community, but especially prevalent here, is a manufactured military driven lack of empathy. So here's some examples for you. We got three men, all with canvas bags, working in an olive grove near the city of, I never know how to pronounce this one, Membij, Mambij, in the fall of 2016. The men had no weapons and were not near any fighting, but the strike cell insisted they must be enemy fighters and killed them with a missile. In early March 2018, Talon Anvil, that's the name of this unit, the strike cell we're talking about, sent a Predator drone over a Syrian farming town called Kamara. And the operator claimed that all civilians had fled and that anyone left in the area was a legitimate target. A drone dropped a 500-pound bomb on a house, and when the smoke cleared, the infrared cameras showed women and children staggering out of the partially collapsed building, some missing limbs, some dragging the dead along with them. At least 23 died in that particular strike, with many more wounded. And then in the U.S. back attack on Raqqa, which was the largest Syrian city held by ISIS in June 2017, civilians sought to flee the fighting and boarded makeshift ferries to cross the Euphrates River. The cell ordered strikes that hit multiple boats, killing at least 30 civilians whose bodies drifted away in the green water. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what we're really talking about here, about some of the choices that they made. Kyle, I'll let you go ahead and jump in, man.
Yeah, I mean, none of this article surprised me because I covered all this throughout 2017, 2018 in particular, on my old foreign policy focus show. And I remember there's this town in Syria on the Euphrates River, I think it's called Tabika or something around that. It holds the dam that creates Lake Assad. So it's pretty easy to find on a map. Anyways, it was one of the more significant battles going on because it was along the Euphrates River, which meant that that this was somewhat of a dividing line between what Assad's forces were trying to take versus what American bad forces were trying to take on the ground. So there were some complications there, but the Assad forces had pushed close to the town, and that was pushing all the ISIS fighters in, and so that was causing the people to want to flee. But the U.S. was dropping leaflets over that side of the city, saying that if you try to flee across the river, we'll bomb you, right? Because they're ostensibly afraid that ISIS fighters are going to come across. And so, I mean, just putting the people of that area in the worst possible position where what do you do? Hope the ISIS fighters don't kill you? Hope the Assad or the Russians don't carry out an airstrike and kill you? And what the Americans are saying that if you try to flee, we're going to bomb you. And that's, there's no option to go across the river, which was the way out. It, just horrific. So all these stories are not super surprising for again people watching, but the New York Times reporting, I do think gives a lot of important details. One is they point out the role of General Townsend, who's now overheading AFRICOM, but he was the head of this war, and they point out that the strikes really had a major uptick once he took command. And so, something to just remember. And back when Trump took power office in 2017, the U.S. was carrying out tons of airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. And now when we look back on it, we talk about the uptake of strikes during Trump, and there is truth to that, definitely. And him and Mass are talking about the annihilation policy and everything like that. But this article shows that it's definitely important to look lower down the totem pole and see who these people are that are actually implementing the strategy in Iraq and Syria, which was General Townsend. And the reason that it's really important to know that isn't, am I like attempting to absolve Trump of, any war crimes committed in Syria, but because this lunatic is now head of AFRICOM. And so if they were able to get away with waging a war like this in Syria, where, for everything else, the government really wasn't blocking out like the internet that much. So there were like videos uploaded of, Syrian airstrikes being carried out, American airstrikes being carried out. There were English speaking reporters. Of course, the US had waged war in Iraq. And so great reporters like, Patrick Coburn and Robert Fisk like had sources in this area, but that doesn't exist as much in Africa. And so, if we're talking about like what's happening in Niger or the rest of the shell or Somalia or anything like that, this is the guy that's now in charge of those wars. So how much do you think we're, getting the truth on it? And how much less likely are we to ever get the truth to come out, because so much less is known now about what's happening?
The the movement by General Townsend to downgrade who was the approving commander for airstrikes was a horrific choice on their part, and especially in this that we can really see it for what it is. They talk about the senior Delta Force guys, E7 Sergeant First Classes, who are making the choices that were previously made at during Obama's, what was it, Drone Tuesday or whatever, where they figured out who they were going to actually shoot. But at the very least, in that, at least there was some oversight. I don't know how good the oversight was, but at least it was that we weren't getting so downgraded to where guys could, for however long they did, pretend that offensive strikes were in fact defensive. But those guys, they don't have. I mean, they're exceptionally good at what they do. Which I wanted to make sure I included a phrase that I remember from a kid when Black Hawk Down was marketing all that special operations stuff and Delta stuff, and I remember they said that controlled, calculated killing. That's what Delta Force was trained to do, is that they were to be people that utilize controlled, calculated killing. That's exactly what this is. How in the world they thought that guys that are, heavy hitters, they're the really tough, most trained guys. Why did they think that these guys would be willing to observe the actual rules when they just came from a raid of whatever kind with people actually, getting hurt and having their own reasons to say, yeah, we're going to bomb the shit out of these guys?
Right. Well, and we do live in a world with like Osama bin Laden and or formerly bin Laden and Baghdadi, and
Yeah, yeah.
like absolutely horrific people, right? And so well, there's a lot of conversation to have, and why I am anti-war and everything like that, but I mean, as somebody kills Bad Daddy, like that doesn't make the world a worse place or anything like that. And so I think when you give people that justification on that kind of level and train them to do that,
Yeah.
but now you're saying like go wage a counterinsurgency, that's entirely different business, and nobody understands that really. It's just all the global war on terror. And so what's the difference between trying to like kill Bad Daddy or bin Laden in a compound or somewhere in rural Idlib versus trying to like liberate Raqqa from a bunch of conscripts and largely Syrian insurgents? I mean, there were other, there were Uyghurs from China and people around the Middle East, veterans of Al Qaeda in Iraq, but a lot of the people that were fighting were just, the local Arab Syrians, Sunni Arab
Yeah.
Syrians, or some of them didn't have a choice. know what I mean? Like ISIS, you either went with them or you died if you were a young male in some cases. And so, we're talking about really kind of different military campaigns, but we have the same people running them. And, for some respect, you should expect this kind of thing to happen.
Our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters, helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out our honorary producers, and they are Will Arens, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Zach H., Ren Jacob, Howard Reynolds, Why I Am Anti-War Podcast, Scott Spaulding, Kenneth Cordasco, Korgoth, and the Status Quo Podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our awesome store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the podcast. Absolutely. It absolutely should be expected. And it goes back to me talking about the different missions that they were sending Delta guys on while they were in country. That this is, the strike cell is certainly more counterterrorism now than counterinsurgency. But that they were going back and forth between those different missions on the same deployment, going from, okay, we're going to go do this raid here. Okay, I need to send 3 guys to go be embedded with the SDF over in this town. And that how do you get any parity on knowing that these guys are going to act in the way that you're supposed to as far as soldiers go, but you send them in between missions and they have no ability to really get acclimated to it. And especially when they take guys like like I said about the controlled calculated killing, guys like Delta, and funnel them into something that is supposed to have, quote unquote, humanitarian controls, humanitarian safeties and protections. There's it's not even farcical anymore. It's just fucking real. It's just I'm sorry by losing my words here for a second. I wanted to read a couple quick quotes from a new article by Patrick Martin at the World Socialist website, and he listed some of the most horrific bombing campaigns that we know of historically, or ones that he had mentioned, and I want to read through them just a little bit of comparison. So the first one is Guernica. It was this vast town was laid to waste by Italian and German bombers on April 26, 1937, at the request of Francisco Franco, leader of the fascist uprising against the Spanish Republic. Bombs rained down for nearly 4 hours, killing just under 1,700 men, women, and children. It was the first test of the new Luftwaffe tactic of saturation terror bombing, soon to be taken up in both sides of World War II. The next one is Ladice. I think I'm saying it right. This Czech village was destroyed by the Nazis in 1942. This one was in reprisal for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, by Czech partisans. Under orders from Hitler and Heinrich Himmler, German forces surrounded the village, killed every male inhabitant 15 years and older, and deported all the women and children to concentration camps. A total of 173 men and boys were shot. Some of the women survived years of labor, but 82 children were gassed within weeks at the Chelmano extermination camp. Every building in the village was demolished and the land plowed over. And the last one, one that will be much more familiar, I'm sure, to your listeners and our listeners, is about My Lai, or excuse me, My Lai. This is the U.S. military designation for Song Mi village, the site of the most infamous U.S. massacre in the Vietnam War. A force commanded by Lieutenant William Calley surrounded the village on March 16, 1968, and began systematically killing more than 500 men, women, and children. Some women were gang raped and then bayoneted, and only Calley was ever tried, and he ended up not serving really any time at all, and said he was just following orders. So I really like that Patrick included that in his piece, that and granted we don't have the confirmation of the same types of numbers that he's talking about from these historical points, but we know that it was the same sentiment, and especially them talking about back in what happened with Hitler, that killing every male inhabitant 15 years and older and deporting all the women and children. Where have we heard about that before?
Yeah, I mean, and there are, if you're just looking like kind of roughly at numbers, I mean, there are instances in Syria where I think at one point they hit a building where they said there was like an ISIS sniper on the second and fourth floor, and there was 100 something civilians on the bottom, and of course they claim secondary explosions within the building caused the building to collapse. Our 500-pound bomb had absolutely nothing to do with it, but it's not questioned that 100+ civilians were killed there. There's, I believe, a case, I think it's 40 to 50 that were killed in a mosque complex that the U.S. acknowledges bombing. I think they maybe even to the end held on to that. Oh, we think there might have been like some Al Qaeda or ISIS meeting happening in the shed out back or something like that. But again, there's no dispute that dozens of civilians were killed. Or I mean, this changes the subject a little bit, but Yemen, there's no dispute that the Saudis killed 150+ civilians in the funeral bombing, and I think that was October of 2018 in the middle of Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. I mean, these kind of war crimes like are happening. It's the looking at the historical stuff is great, but like it does happen all the time in the US, or at the very least, our proxy princes are more than responsible for it.
So I wanted to take a minute and talk about the stretching of this notion of self-defense as a concept. That I when looking at how we've been behaving, how American foreign policy has been behaving towards Syrian and Iraqi militias, and calling them self-defense strikes, saying that these strikes are in self-defense without giving any backing as to saying how they're able to justify that. And I feel like that this whole thing with this Talon Anvil unit, that they're really trying as hard as they can to twist up for people the basic notion of what self-defense is. That it's not that it has to be the concept, what situation that you're dealing with. It has to be defended. You can't just simply say it was self-defense and everyone moves on. But that's what they want people to do. They want people to hear self-defense and to stop asking questions. I also see it as connected to the choice by U.S. forces to not take prisoners during the ISIS offensive, that they would simply give them over to whatever Iraqi or Syrian proxies they had there, and whether that person was tortured to death, used in other horrific acts that didn't specifically involve physical violence. That all of this, I don't see how, if I was still in the military, how I would be able to coalesce my troops around the actual rules and ideas they're supposed to follow, because it's back and forth so much. And at a certain point, they're not just denying what they're doing, they're denying the English language as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so much there. Like with the taking captives part, uh again, there is a difference. Like, not that it was a great choice ever to be an ISIS fighter, but the life or death, sometimes that's what you got to do.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then the US captures you and hands you over to the Iraqi government, where a court sentences you and 20 other people to death with a swing of the gavel. Or I don't know, maybe it's different in Islamic court, and Americanizing it too much, but like they were doing that, like even with women, even wives of Iraqi fighters were sentenced in groups of I think 10 or more at times to death, and everything like that. And there wasn't like no questions, or just kind of shrugs the shoulder and I mean, and by the way, those prison camps, like I don't know how to say HOL in Syria, there's thousands of women and formerly children. Some of them have literally grown up in this prison camp, where the only like kind of instruction is kind of coming from the wives of the former like higher ranking ISIS fighters. And by the way, they all report that the way it kind of works in the prison camp there is, if you want like decent stuff, you have to like please sexually somebody. And that, I mean, that happens in refugee camps all over the world, right? But in this one, there's women and children reporting sexual abuse and all that pretty rampantly. And so I mean, like, it's absolutely horrific what's all going on in Syria. By the way, our SDF partners, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds were backing on the ground, are conscripting, or at least there are parents of that are going to the UN offices within Syria and protesting, saying that the SDF came by and kidnapped their 15-year-old daughter to go fight in the American led war and all this kind of stuff. And so even when we're not looking at directly what the US has been doing, what our partners have been doing there have been absolutely horrific. And I mean, from talking to some people who were working with the Kurds in Iraq and Syria, they were saying that they particularly treat the Yazidi people really bad, and are extremely racist against them. And so everybody in the US mainstream media pretends that we have these great like Islamic Kurdish fighters who are out there, and these are like good Western oriented people who let their women fight. And it's not the case at all. It's just it's all disgusting. Sorry if I got too much away from the point that you were trying to make there.
No, no, yeah, no. I appreciate you filling in that in. There was actually a couple details there that I didn't know about. Um, but no, that the entirety of our strategy of trying to call everybody fighters and to not look at mitigating factors for people who are simply trying to stay alive. This isn't a, I get to pick the terrorist group of the week that I really want to be a part of. This is people choosing, whether under threat of death or just hungry mouths, what are they going to do? Um, and it and
And Oh, and not to make like too much of the ISIS villains and everything like that, because I think some of this was exaggerated, but they were like burning people alive and stuff
yeah,
like that too. Like it wasn't just like you get a bullet in the head; it's they're gonna burn you alive, and so that might. But the other thing I remember what I was gonna mention is just looking at kind of like the U.S., where it's as simple as a cop saying like, oh, his hand was near his waistband, or I saw something in his waistband, or I got my big black iPhone with an OtterBots on it, and boy, doesn't that look like a gun if I'm running away from a cop. And all these kind of markers are as simple as the cops in the US need to declare self-defense. Well, imagine if it's drone video is what they're using, then who and at least in the US, not that there's really justice for cops or anything, but when the cops shoot somebody, they do go over and look. In Syria, if you drop a drone strike on them, I mean, you never really know if it was a cane or a rifle, right?
nope,
And nobody is really going to go through and try to discern. And then if you do it, and I'm sure you've gotten enough of this yourself, oh, then you're sticking up for the ISIS fires and you're trying to cover for the terrorist and all this kind of stuff. And like, I am not questioning that there are bad things that people that ISIS did in Syria, but that doesn't justify just carpet bombing civilians at will.
no, no. There's nothing about that that is should be wholesale slaughter of a people because they make those kind of choices. Um, And no, I'm really glad that you mentioned. I had made a note. I can't find it at the moment, but about the domestic and police comparison here. That it's moving so far beyond any kind of reality that they can point to say this is the reason that we're doing this. And but like you said, is that the and Townsend even they was it Townsend or Votel? I can't remember, but talking about like you said is that there no one goes to these places, no one goes to these drone strikes and looks for bodies and looks for anything, looks for weapons to determine if that was actually happening. So every time that they bring up stuff like this, they can spin a fiction about exactly how successful it's being. And then we just got back into we're fighting for attrition statistics over anything else, and that we're back into to like we're fighting again in Vietnam, and by the more bad guys that we kill says that we're winning, but that's not at all the case of what we're dealing with here.
I guess the one small difference I think in Syria versus Vietnam is rather than focusing on just how many they were killing, they're really just trying to color in the map. I mean,
Sure.
that was the whole go to erase ISIS from them, to color in the American side, and that's what they're trying to do. And there wasn't when that's the top priority, then again, what I don't want to be the person that has to decide what happens when there's like an ISIS sniper in a building, and there's also civilians in those buildings.
Sure.
But I don't think the United States should be waging that air war across the world. Let the Syrian people figure out. And if you kind of look at what happened during the Syrian war, Assad cut far more deals with the U.S. to move people out of different areas rather than dropping like indiscriminate bombs all over them and stuff like that. Not that Assad didn't kill a lot of civilians too, but I do think that when you're talking about local actors, sometimes they, Assad realizes that he has to not be so indiscriminate that he destroys his own country completely to pieces. And the U.S. doesn't have to worry about that. Like, we flattened Raqqa and that's fine. At um and so I think there's more of an incentive to work out deals. And we saw this all over the place in East Aleppo and Duma and Dara, all over that that area of Syria. Now there's an awful lot of Al Qaeda guys that, by the way, are backed by the U.S. NATO allies Turkey in Idlib, Syria. But that did mean not having to flatten certain areas by cutting those kind of deals and doing that kind of stuff. And oh, by the way, the U.S. actively hindered some of those agreements from happening too. Like ISIS was, I think they like cut a deal with ISIS to move people from Palmyra to some other town, and since they were moving them in the general direction of the American forces, the U.S. started dropping bombs to prevent those buses from moving, which, again, I don't know the solution here, but I don't think, Americans pushing red buttons should be the deciders of what happens in Syria when they're trying to, deal with a war in their country where you have jihadist factions.
And alongside, although we like you're mentioning about so much, there is really good reporting on in terms of what is actually happening there. um Sorry, I got memory issues, I'm sorry.
No, no.
um um I guess the thought that I had in my mind was going back to the self-defense claim, is that we're the and this and we're there's a whole subsection of people in support of the American military and doing these things. The belief that carpet bombing them back to the Stone Age is the acceptable, needed solution to these things, and it's so far away from the actual reality. Like you've mentioned a couple times today about the not the non-terrorist related reasons why somebody would join up with some of these organizations. That we want to be able to paint these bad guys in a very specific light, and it makes it easier to kill them and to kill their families. And I feel like I'm out of words to say about it. Um, and
No,
it's go ahead, man. Go
I was
ahead.
just gonna. I mean, it's just ugly, and it got ugly because of America got involved in large part. I mean, you could go all the way back to 2012, and Flynn was the director of what. I forget the director of the intelligence agency ODNI maybe, and he's warning, he's saying like all these weapons we're pouring into Syria is going to create a caliphate, and so that's the point where the US could have like made a decision not to deal with ISIS by not pouring in all those weapons. Once
Yeah,
ISIS was created, then you have a really ugly situation in Syria, and of course it's in part created by Assad and his family's brutal rule for years and years. And I mean, his father committed awful crimes, and certainly his barrel bombing and stuff like that. But again, at the same time, it never would have gotten as ugly as it did in Syria. I mean, and you could even roll back to Libya too. It'd be like, well,
yeah, yeah,
if we did kick over Gaddafi, it probably wouldn't have been nothing like it was in Syria. But once everything gets as ugly as it is, it's kind of hard to like figure out like what to say and what to do about it. But I just wish I guess my country would bow out and just realize that we've created a real issue there, but it can't be solved with our bombs, especially, or our troops. What I mean? Like maybe there are ways for America or Americans to mitigate some of the problems happening in Syria, lifting sanctions, providing a little bit of aid. Although providing aid is a complicated thing, and isn't always productive, especially when it goes through some of these international agencies that are more concerned about stealing money and their own geopolitical issues and everything like that. But some aid or other things like that, assisting refugees, all that kind of stuff. But no, that's not what we're talking about here. That's not what the US is doing anywhere in the world. And so
yeah.
that's that's why I at least don't be involved in it, and don't be involved in the killing.
Yeah, if people are killing themselves, us involving ourselves with more death and destruction, which we're really good at, is only going to exacerbate whatever crisis that we've brought in there. And I still think about, I when I was in Iraq, very common sight to see bombed out places, houses, buildings, apartment buildings, stuff like that. And now even post, Operation Iraqi Freedom, thinking about how much horrific it is there now. I think about, all of the other places I drove past that are just craters, places where people used to live, kids used to play, and people stuck between absolutely impossible circumstances. It kills me, man. I don't even know like what the words would be to say about it. But as you said, and you hit it right on the money, man, is that our bombs, our bullets, our troops, our sanctions, none of it is needed. None of it is we're not actively protecting the America in any way, shape, or form, whether people or land. And I lost my thought again there again.
I mean, this happens like when I try to talk about Yemen sometimes, right? When, you're reading these stories about like the family that's, trying to figure out like if they should just buy food for the kids that are in the house and hope their kids don't succumb to cholera, or take the money that you could buy for food that taking away from the other kids means that they don't eat, not that they have to eat like bologna sandwiches, but legitimately that they don't eat, or that they're eating like a combination of like food that they scavenge from landfills and boiled down leaves and all this kind of stuff. And you just like what kind of words can you say, how can you describe what it must be like for those parents to like have to live in those conditions? And then again, like I guess I feel like to just say I'm not like particularly naive about the world, and I understand that like poverty is going to exist in some places regardless of what the US does, but it doesn't have to exist in Yemen like it does.
No.
But it does because of America, and so that's like like that's the thing that is just so intolerable. It's hard to find words for, is that there's suffering going on for absolutely no reason, really, I guess, other than, the like kind of America religious narrative and the, funding that, people get through the military industrial complex and all that. But at the same time, it just seems so stupid to say, like, people want to be a few $1 million richer, so we're going to starve Yemeni children to death. And there's, there's a lot of, gaps in between there, and explaining to like how it happens, and that allows people to, like, have their cognitive dissonance, I'm sure. But at the same time, like, that is bottom line what's happening. And same thing in Iraq and Syria. I'm sure Raytheon was happy as hell every time one of these bombs went off, because it was another, few $100,000 that they were making off selling another one. And of course, the people that they killed, I mean, even if they were innocent civilians, and even if they got quote unquote justice, they would like get from the United fraction of the amount of money that the missile that the U.S. fired cost, right? We're talking about $4,000 or $5,000. The U.S. would have to kill 50 people to have the equivalent of a Hellfire missile. And I don't know, that just kind of goes to show what we value.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to wrap it up for today. Kyle, thank you so much for coming to chat with me, man. I really appreciated your insights and your vision on topics like this. And will you remind the good folks where they can find your work and find your podcast?
Yeah, so I mean, the easiest thing to do is just go to the Libertarian Institute. If you go to the homepage there, my name's on the top of it. If you click Kyle, you'll see all my news roundups and all my shows. If you read one or listen to one, and you'll know what's happening in most of the wars. And then check out antiwar.com. Of course, the great Dave DeCamp and Jason Ditz are writing up the news every day, but right under that, you'll find the viewpoints. And so we have several original writers, Dub Bandow, Daniel Larison, Scott Horton, Dave DeCamp, Ray McGovern, Danny Shershin, and so many other great people who write. Ted Schneider for antiwar.com, and and all those viewpoints. Yeah, they're down there, you can find them. And yeah, that's what you should check out to follow my work. And thank you so much for having me on. Like I said, I'm a fan of this show, and your audience should subscribe, because we'll have to do something in the next few weeks, and they can hear you on my show.
Hell yeah, hell yeah. No, I'm excited about what the kind of work that we could do together, and I think it's going to be great, man. So, thanks again for giving your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not detain